Pay attention to what the excavator finds at 2 meters. The geotechnical report for 14 Dunmore Road had described the subsurface conditions as uniform fill over natural clay, with no anomalous features, no groundwater concerns, and no obstructions at the planned foundation depth of 2.4 meters. The report had been filed 6 weeks earlier by a licensed geotechnical firm. It had passed county review without comment. It was the kind of report that a site foreman reads once, notes the key figures, and sets aside. Ben Aldric had set it aside. He is 44 years old and has worked in residential and commercial construction for 17 years, the last 9 of them as a site foreman for Kellner Construction. He grew up in a family that did concrete and masonry work, his father and 2 uncles, all of them tradesmen, all of them with the particular habit of reading a site before touching it. He learned the same habit. He knows what a clean geotechnical report looks like, and he knows what a clean excavation looks like, and he knows, within the first few minutes of a dig, whether the ground is going to behave the way the report said it would. He has been wrong twice in 17 years. Both times the deviation was minor. This is not going to be minor. At 7:22 a.m. on a Monday in March, the excavator begins its first pass on the north section of the foundation footprint at 14 Dunmore Road. The morning is overcast. The lot is flat and clear. The previous structure, a single-story commercial building, had been demolished 6 years earlier, and the lot had sat empty since. The site plan calls for a 3-bedroom residential structure on a full perimeter foundation, standard construction for this part of Callaway County. The excavator makes its first pass, then its second. At 2.1 meters, the operator stops the machine. Aldric is at the lip of the excavation within 30 seconds. He looks down at what the bucket has turned up. The soil profile is wrong. A standard fill-over clay profile presents in consistent horizontal layers, darker topsoil grading into lighter subsoil grading into the pale gray of natural clay. What Aldric is looking at does not grade. It alternates, dark material over light over dark, in bands that do not follow any natural depositional sequence. The layers are mixed and irregular, as if someone had removed a column of earth and replaced it without sorting or compacting it in the correct order. He reaches into the excavation and takes a handful of material from the disturbed zone. He breaks it apart, mixed within the soil, small fragments of broken concrete, what appears to be compacted clay of a different consistency than the surrounding material, and a faint but distinct whitish powder distributed unevenly through the sample. He recognizes the powder. It is hydrated lime. He calls the geotechnical engineer of record at 7:51 a.m. and describes what he has found. The engineer arrives at 9:14 a.m., takes his own samples from multiple points within the disturbed zone, and spends approximately 40 minutes examining the material before offering his assessment. The soil in this area had been excavated and replaced. Not recently. His estimate, based on the degree of reconsolidation and the state of the organic material in the disturbed zone, is that the excavation occurred somewhere between 3 and 6 years ago. The replacement fill had been compacted manually or with light equipment, not with a mechanical compactor. The lime distribution was irregular and appeared to have been introduced deliberately. Lime is sometimes used in burial contexts to suppress organic decomposition odors and to accelerate surface breakdown of biological material, though it can also serve other purposes. Aldric pulls the permit history for 14 Dunmore Road on his phone. County records show the following: a demolition permit for the existing structure, filed and executed in late 2018 and early 2019. No subsequent permits of any kind. No grading permit. No utility work permit. No excavation permit. No permit that would authorize any subsurface disturbance at any point between the demolition and the current project. Whatever had been done to this ground had been done without authorization and without any official record. He calls the Callaway County Sheriff's Department non-emergency line at 10:07 a.m. Deputy Lena Cole arrives at 10:44 a.m. She examines the excavation, speaks with the geotechnical engineer, and reads the permit history on Aldric's phone. She calls Detective Ray Coulter at the Criminal Investigations Unit at 11:02 a.m. Coulter arrives at 11:39 a.m. and immediately requests that the excavation be halted and the site be cordoned. Coulter has worked property crimes and fraud investigations for 11 years. He has encountered buried material before, usually in cases involving agricultural land disputes or illegal dumping. But the combination of deliberate lime application, irregular compaction, and the specific location characteristics of this lot prompt him to request a forensic archaeology unit rather than a standard evidence recovery team. The forensic unit arrives the following morning. The forensic excavation of the disturbed zone takes 3 days. It is systematic and slow. At a depth of 2.1 to 2.8 meters, within the disturbed area, the team recovers the following: 4 metal document storage cases, sealed with industrial tape that has partially degraded, 11 hard drives of varying manufacture, each enclosed in a separate heavy-gauge plastic bag, a quantity of printed documents in degraded but partially legible condition, bundled in waterproof sleeves that have not fully preserved the contents, and several items of office equipment, a label maker, an external storage device, a portable hard drive dock, individually bagged in the same heavy-gauge plastic. The lime had been distributed throughout the fill material surrounding these items, not beneath them. The geotechnical engineer's revised assessment: the lime had been used primarily to mask the presence of the buried material from any surface detection, and secondarily to create a thermal and chemical environment that would gradually degrade organic components of the documents. The metal cases and the hard drives had been more resistant to the lime environment than anticipated. 7 of the 11 hard drives were recovered in functional condition. Callaway County property records show that 14 Dunmore Road had been owned at the time of the demolition by Rendell Logistics Corporation, a mid-size freight forwarding and logistics company that had operated in the county for 22 years before entering bankruptcy proceedings in 2018. The company had been formally dissolved and its assets liquidated in early 2019. The land at 14 Dunmore Road had passed to a county receivership and been sold at public auction 3 years later, ultimately acquired by the developer who had commissioned the current construction project. The dissolution of Rendell Logistics Corporation had not been straightforward. At the time of its bankruptcy filing, the company was the subject of an active civil suit brought by a group of former employees, 23 individuals who alleged systematic underpayment of wages, improper deductions from retirement contributions, and deliberate manipulation of payroll records over a period of approximately 7 years. The suit had been filed in 2017. In November 2018, the presiding judge had issued a formal discovery order requiring Rendell to produce specific categories of financial documentation: payroll records for the period 2011 through 2018, records of all retirement fund contributions and disbursements, and the contents of the company's primary management email server to be delivered in an accessible digital format within 30 days. The 30 days passed. Rendell's legal representatives notified the court that the required records had been destroyed in a fire at a company storage facility. A fire investigation report, prepared by a licensed fire investigator and submitted to the court as supporting documentation, described the incident as an accidental electrical fire that had consumed the storage unit and its contents. An insurance claim had been filed and paid, $340,000 for the destroyed contents. The court had accepted the documentation. The civil suit had been placed in procedural suspension, pending the identification of alternative evidentiary sources. For 6 years, no alternative sources had been identified. The fire investigator, whose license number appeared on the submitted report, had, at the time the report was dated, held a license that had been suspended by the state licensing board following an unrelated disciplinary matter. He had not conducted any fire investigations during the suspension period. He had not prepared the report bearing his name and license number. When contacted by investigators, he stated that he had become aware of at least 2 other fraudulent uses of his license number during the suspension period and had reported these to the board at the time. Neither report had been cross-referenced against the Rendell submission. The fire had not happened. The documents had been buried. The functional hard drives recovered from the excavation were imaged and analyzed by a digital forensics specialist over a period of 11 days. The recovered data was extensive and largely intact. It included payroll records for the full period specified in the court's discovery order, records of retirement fund contributions showing systematic shortfalls against what employees had been told they would receive, and a significant volume of management correspondence, email threads, internal memos, and in several cases audio recordings of meetings that documented awareness of the payroll irregularities at the executive level and deliberate decisions to conceal them from employees and from regulatory review. The materials were precisely what the court had ordered Rendall to produce in 2018. They had been buried beneath the footprint of the demolished building at some point in the weeks between the issuance of the court order and the execution of the demolition permit, a window of approximately 8 weeks. The former chief executive officer of Rendall Logistics Corporation was Warren Cade, 59 years old. He had led the company for 14 years before its dissolution and had been its principal decision-maker throughout the period covered by the civil suit. In the years following the company's dissolution, Cade had relocated internationally, initially to a country without an extradition treaty with the United States, then, whether by miscalculation or changing circumstances, to one that was covered. He had continued working as a business consultant in his new location, under his own name, with no apparent expectation of being found. The combination of Interpol coordination, a formal extradition request, and a 14-month legal process resulted in his return to the United States. He arrived in handcuffs at a regional airport on a Tuesday morning, 14 months after the excavation. At 14 Dunmore Road had been halted. The charges included criminal contempt of court for willful failure to comply with the discovery order, obstruction of justice, wire fraud in connection with the submission of the falsified fire investigation report, insurance fraud in connection with the fraudulent insurance claim, and multiple counts related to the underlying wage and retirement fund violations. The civil suit was reinstated with the recovered materials as primary evidence. All 23 original plaintiffs were reinstated as parties. The criminal trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 8 days before returning guilty verdicts on the primary counts. Cade was sentenced to 14 years. 3 other former Rendall executives who had participated in the decision to bury the materials were charged separately. 2 entered guilty pleas. 1 was convicted at trial. The civil judgment, entered following the criminal verdict, awarded the 23 former employees a combined total exceeding $4 million, inclusive of back wages, retirement fund shortfalls, interest calculated from the date of the original violations, and additional damages for the 6-year delay caused by the destruction and concealment of evidence. The judgment was partially satisfied through the liquidation of assets that had been identified in the course of the criminal investigation as improperly shielded from the original bankruptcy proceedings. Evelyn Marsh had worked in Rendall's accounting department for 19 years. She was 61 years old when the verdict was entered. She had been one of the original 23 plaintiffs and one of the few who had remained actively engaged with the case through all 6 years of its suspension, attending every status hearing, maintaining correspondence with the plaintiff's legal team, and keeping her own parallel file of records she had retained from her time at the company. The records she had retained were personal copies, not the originals, and they had been insufficient to satisfy the court's evidentiary standard without the primary documentation. She had known from the first day of the lawsuit exactly what the primary documentation would show. She had prepared portions of it herself. She had loaded some of it onto the servers that had later been described as destroyed by fire. What she was owed in back wages, in retirement fund shortfalls, in 7 years of interest, had been calculable from the first day of the lawsuit if the records had existed. The records had existed. They had been in the ground beneath the building where she had spent 19 years of her working life. She told investigators, "I knew what those records said. I had been waiting 6 years for someone to find them." Callaway County amended its pre-construction review procedures in the months following the case. Properties with documented histories of active litigation or unresolved legal proceedings at the time of prior demolition are now subject to a mandatory subsurface survey before construction permits are issued. The survey requirement was proposed in a written submission to the County Planning Board by Ben Aldric on behalf of Kellner Construction. Callaway County amended its pre-construction review procedures in the months following the case. Properties with documented histories of active litigation or unresolved legal proceedings at the time of prior demolition are now subject to a mandatory subsurface survey before construction permits are issued. The survey requirement was proposed in a written submission to the County Planning Board by Ben Aldric on behalf of Kellner Construction. The submission described the sequence of events at 14 Dunmore Road in procedural terms, what had been found, when, at what depth, and what the finding had produced, without editorial comment. The Planning Board adopted the requirement at its next scheduled meeting. It was the first amendment to the county's pre-construction review protocol in 11 years. Ben Aldric completed the foundation at 14 Dunmore Road 4 months after the initial excavation, following the conclusion of the forensic work and the full remediation of the disturbed soil zone. The foundation was poured on a clear morning in July. The crew arrived at 6 a.m. The pour began at 7:30. Aldric stood at the edge of the foundation formwork and watched the concrete fill the perimeter. The ground beneath it had been certified clean by the forensic team and resurveyed by the geotechnical engineer of record. The report said uniform fill. This time, it was. He did not look at the geotechnical report again before the pour. He had already read the ground. He knew, now, that reading it once was not always enough.